Slaanesh needed the psychic death scream of an entire galaxy-spanning civilization to be born. Billions of Aeldari souls ripped into the warp in a single instant, carving out a wound in reality so enormous it became the Eye of Terror. That's what it cost to make one Chaos God. Khorne woke up because some Europeans were having a bad few centuries. That's wildly stupid lore, and today I'm putting Games Workshop on trial for it. Here's the charge. GW built 4 cosmic entities that are supposed to be older than civilization, more powerful than gods, and utterly indifferent to human existence, and then quietly tied 3 of them to medieval European history as their birth condition. The Warhammer fandom wiki, synthesizing canon sources, places Khorne's awakening in the 2nd millennium during Terra's European Middle Ages. Same for Nurgle, explicitly connected to the Great Plagues sweeping old Earth during that period. Same general era for Tzeentch, though the specific codex citation for his awakening date is wiki synthesis rather than hard print canon, worth flagging the same way the ordering issue is. Meanwhile, Slaanesh was born in the early 30th millennium from the fall of the Aeldari, a galactic extinction event. The gap between those two things isn't a rounding error, it's the entire thesis. And before anyone objects, yes, the wiki places these dates as community-synthesized canon rather than hard codex text for every detail. No specific awakening year for any of these gods appears in a printed codex. Those particular figures circulate as community consensus built from wiki synthesis. But the medieval framing for Khorne and Nurgle's awakenings does appear in the fandom wiki articles for those gods, and no official GW source contradicts it. So we're working with the best available canon record, and that record is damning enough. 4 exhibits, 1 verdict. Gork and Mork are going to show up after each one. You'll understand why. Exhibit 1, Khorne. The Blood God is the first Chaos God to have awakened. His domain is warfare, rage, bloodshed, skull-taking, the full catalog of martial violence. Per the canonical record, he came into being because humanity was fighting wars on one planet during the Middle Ages, not galaxy-wide carnage, not a civilization collapsing into the warp. Medieval territorial disputes on a single inhabited rock, a species that had barely figured out siege engines, a conflict radius measurable in hundreds of miles. Now hold that against what the setting itself tells us about pre-human history. The official Warhammer 40k fandom wiki dates the war in heaven to more than 60 million years ago. That figure comes from the wiki rather than a hard print codex, so treat it with the same sourcing caveat as the medieval awakening dates, but it's the best canonical record available. The Old Ones, an ancient, hyper-advanced species, were at war with the Necrons and their Satan star gods in a conflict described as galaxy-spanning carnage involving massive psychic upheaval. The Old Ones also created the Krork, proto-orc soldiers, as weapons in this war. The death toll of that conflict wasn't measured in hundreds of thousands of medieval peasants. It was measured in species. Entire civilizations were mobilized, corrupted, and annihilated across hundreds of star systems over what may have been millions of years. Every ingredient Khorne is supposed to respond to — rage, bloodshed, the industrial-scale destruction of living things — was present at concentrations that dwarf anything medieval Europe ever managed. Khorne didn't stir, not once, not even a stretch. GW's own lore acknowledges there's no explanation for this. Nothing in the canonical record accounts for why a galaxy-spanning, multi-species conflict on this scale failed to awaken the god of blood and war. The lore gap is real, and it's unaddressed. Now, some in the community, specifically the lore prosecutor contingent who will absolutely be in the comments, will cite the veil. The argument goes that the barrier between real space and the warp was different before humanity. Human psychic resonance specifically feeds the chaos gods in a way other species don't. The Old Ones maintained a different relationship with the warp, and the veil between real space and the immaterium functioned differently during the war in heaven. Therefore, Khorne stayed seated because the psychic signal wasn't tuned to his frequency. That's not a bad defense. GW does establish that warp time is non-linear and that the nature of the barrier between real space and the warp changes across history. But here's where the prosecution rests. GW never uses this explanation to address the war in heaven. The time has no meaning in the warp principle exists in canon. It's discussed extensively in lore community discourse and is treated as established metaphysics, but that same principle is selectively applied to excuse inconsistencies in the human era timeline and never invoked to explain why 60+ million years of galaxy-scale violence preceded the Chaos God's awakening without producing a single one of them. GW gets to use the defense only if they actually deploy it. They don't. The silence is structural. The veil argument is the audience's reconstruction of a defense GW never mounted. And even granting the veil argument full credit, even if pre-human species couldn't feed the Chaos Gods, that still doesn't explain why Khorne needed specifically the European Middle Ages of Terra's second millennium, rather than any of the alien wars happening simultaneously across the galaxy. Khorne woke up when humanity started fighting. That's not metaphysical coincidence. That's a writing choice that puts humanity at the center of a cosmology explicitly designed to be indifferent to it. One subsidiary note on Kabanda. He's one of Khorne's most powerful bloodthirsters, a greater demon with wings who flies across battlefields. Khorne's entire doctrine holds that his followers never use psychic powers, that the blood god abhors the trickery of magic. Demons are, by definition, supernatural magical constructs. The only available resolution is that demon existence itself is inherently magical, which means Kabanda operates under a categorical exemption GW never formally acknowledges. The contradiction is contested rather than clean. Confidence in the evidence sits around 0.85, making it a footnote rather than a centerpiece. But it illustrates the pattern. The rules of Khorne's domain have so many structural exceptions that the rules barely function as rules. A doctrine with unlimited asterisks is an aesthetic, not a theology. Gork and Mork were born from every orc that ever lived, believed, or fought across the entire galaxy. Their psychic gestalt draws from billions of creatures spanning countless star systems. They didn't need a specific era on a specific planet. They didn't need a particular human century. They needed orcs to be orcs, which was already true before humanity discovered iron. Exhibit 1, closed. Exhibit 2, Tzeentch. The Changer of Ways is supposed to be the most intelligent, most scheming, most cosmically far-sighted entity in the setting. His defining characteristic is that he plans so many steps ahead that his apparent losses are secretly victories. This is a legitimate archetype, the villain who can't lose because every outcome was calculated. Done well, it's terrifying. Done badly, it becomes a writing crutch that excuses the author from ever committing to a consequence. GW does it badly. This is audience observation, rather than a documented canonical catalog. No specific Black Library novel passages confirming this pattern appear in the source record, which puts the confidence on this particular claim at around 0.30. So call it what it's, a meme that became a community diagnosis. But the shape of it's consistent enough that you've encountered it. Whenever Tzeentch fails at something, whenever his schemes are disrupted, whenever his servants are destroyed, whenever the heroes win, the narrative gestures vaguely at the idea that this was the intended outcome all along. Tzeentch smiles, something cryptic gets said, and the defeat transforms retroactively into a plan. The community shorthand is precise. This is how an idiot writes a smart character. It doesn't matter how badly he loses, the writer just adds, just as planned. This matters beyond the meme. A villain who can't lose isn't threatening, he's weightless. Every Tzeentch story has the same dramatic structure. Something happens, Tzeentch responds with cryptic satisfaction, and the audience is left uncertain whether anything was ever actually at stake. Uncertainty isn't dread, it's just fog. The connection to the Thousand Suns is worth raising here. The Thousand Suns are Space Marines, one of GW's marquee model lines. Tzeentch is their patron. No GW official statement links Tzeentch's narrative prominence directly to the Thousand Suns' commercial performance, so this remains an inference rather than a documented motive. But the pattern is observable. Factions that move product tend to receive more lore attention, and Magnus the Red receives substantial Tzeentch-adjacent plot attention. GW's cosmological priorities and GW's commercial priorities trend in the same direction, and the god of scheming benefits most from a setting where the author's hand is never supposed to show. The actual tragedy of Tzeentch isn't that he plots. It's that the just-as-planned defense makes him dramatically inert regardless of what actually happens around him. The medieval European anxiety that supposedly birthed him, human hope, ambition, the desperate drive to change fate, deserved a better literary heir than a smirking puppet master who shrugs at every outcome because the writer ran out of consequences. Tzeentch woke up in the same era as Khorne and Nurgle. The god of cosmic scheming and infinite foresight needed one planet's worth of ambitious humans during the Middle Ages to cross whatever threshold births a deity. He shares a birth era with a plague god. Gork doesn't scheme. Mork schemes, but only in the sense that Mork headbutts you when you're not looking instead of when you are. Neither of them needs a narrative fallback to explain why they won. The outcome is unambiguous because orcs don't write themselves escape hatches. Exhibit 2, closed. Exhibit 3, Slaanesh. Born in the early 30th millennium from the fall of the Aeldari. The birth scream killed billions in a single instant. The psychic detonation devoured a great section of the galaxy and became the Eye of Terror. The fandom wiki source confirms this directly. Slaanesh was born and its birth cries decimated the race, drawing the spirits of billions of Aeldari into the warp to be consumed by the newborn. That's the scale required to make She Who Thirsts. Then the setting immediately tells you that the youngest of the major chaos gods can't yet hold its own against any one other major chaos god. The youngest, the weakest. Despite requiring the most catastrophic birth conditions in the entire pantheon by an enormous margin, the Warhammer potential man, the character whose origin demands more than anyone else's, whose post-heresy record doesn't exist as a documented catalog of victories anywhere in the canon, and that absence is genuinely unconfirmed in either direction. Not a confirmed loss streak, because no comprehensive source provides the win-loss accounting that would let you call it either way. But a god whose plot-relevant moments are concentrated in events that ended 10,000 years before the main timeline, as community observation rather than a documented canonical record, isn't exactly an active force in the setting's present tense. Slaanesh exists mostly as a threat category, something that might act rather than something that does. One place this script is going to disagree with some prior coverage of this topic, and the disagreement matters. The Drukhari, the Dark Eldar, aren't Slaanesh worshippers. They didn't choose excess. They didn't commit to sensation as an ideology. Slaanesh devours their souls if they stop. The canonical mechanic is survival through compulsion. Drukhari inflict pain and suffering on other species specifically because that sensation generates enough psychic energy to stave off Slaanesh's consumption of their souls. They raid and torture not out of devotion, but because the alternative is being slowly eaten by a god they had nothing to do with creating. That's not worship. That's extortion. Framing the Drukhari as hedonists by choice misses the entire tragedy of their existence and gets the lore wrong in a way that knowledgeable viewers will clock immediately. The structural problem with Slaanesh is the entry price versus the return. The Eldar civilization that fell to birth her wasn't a backwater. It was a galaxy-spanning empire that had existed for longer than humanity's entire timeline. Billions of souls went into the warp in a single moment. The Eye of Terror opened. A permanent scar in real space, still present in the 41st millennium, marks the location where this happened. And the product of all that is a god who, by her own canonical description, can't yet hold her own against any of the others one-on-one. GW set the bar for Slaanesh's birth at galactic extinction, and then classified the result as the weakest member of the group. Gork and Mork never needed an entire interstellar civilization to die for them to exist. Orcs believe, orcs fight, and the gods are. The transaction is clean, proportionate, and makes internal sense. No species had to be erased. Exhibit 3. Closed. Exhibit 4. Nurgle. The Plague Lord is widely described as a loving grandfather figure, joyful, forgiving, welcoming of all his children regardless of their condition. Decay is a gift. Sickness is an embrace. Nurgle doesn't punish, he nurtures in his rancid way. This is his defining characterization across decades of community and lore framing. He has devotees rather than subjects because he seems genuinely warm compared to the demands of the other Chaos gods. Khorne wants endless martial excellence. Tzeentch wants you to be a chess piece. Slaanesh wants everything from you, forever. Nurgle wants to give you a hug and share his newest disease. Then introduce the sloppity bilepipers. These demonic heralds of Nurgle exist within his court. The specific codex text detailing their function needs primary source verification before being stated as confirmed lore. So the precise mechanism isn't being presented here as established fact. And that disclaimer belongs here before anything else is said about them. What the audience reaction to their existence signals is that something in their function sits at an uncomfortable distance from the grandfather framing. GW hasn't resolved that tension with anything definitive, and a court that won't examine its own evidence doesn't get to claim the contradiction isn't there.
What can be confirmed without qualification? Nurgle's awakening was explicitly tied to the Great Plagues sweeping old Earth during the Second Millennium, specifically during the European Middle Ages. The Warhammer 40k fandom wiki is direct about this. Nurgle emerged as great plagues swept across the world, with the Black Death and its contemporaries as the clear historical referent. One planet, one species, a pathogen that killed roughly a third of Europe's population. The god of universal plague and decay across all of existence, whose domain spans every biological death in the galaxy across billions of years, was triggered by a medieval outbreak that lasted a few generations and stayed on one continent. The Vermintide and Darktide angle is worth naming honestly. In those games, Warhammer Fantasy and 40k settings respectively, a small team of soldiers routinely destroys enormous numbers of Nurgle followers in a single engagement. This is gameplay, not a canonical story beat, and the distinction matters. But the absurdity it illustrates is genuine. The followers of the eternal plague god, supposedly beloved and protected by their deity, get massacred by a handful of strangers on an afternoon with no narrative consequence for Nurgle whatsoever. The god of endurance and inevitability loses his people by the thousands every time someone boots up a session, and the lore doesn't account for it because lore and gameplay exist in a truce that benefits GW commercially and collapses logically the moment you think about it for 30 seconds. Nurgle is simultaneously the god of slow, unstoppable decay and a faction whose foot soldiers die fast enough to constitute a sport. Gork doesn't claim to be forgiving. Mork doesn't pretend to be kind. Their relationship with their followers is transactional and honest. Fight well, believe hard, and the gods fight with you. No orc gets confused about what Gork wants. There are no demonic heralds in Gork's court, whose existence sits in uncomfortable tension with Gork's stated values, because Gork's stated values are hit things very hard, and everything in his domain is aligned with that without contradiction. Exhibit 4. Closed. Now the summation. GW has one canonical defense available for all of this. Time has no meaning in the warp. The warp exists outside linear causality. Events that happened millions of years ago might not register in the warp when they happen. Only later, or not at all, depending on the psychic resonance of the species involved. The Chaos Gods are creatures of the warp, not of real space. Their births aren't necessarily synchronized to the events that caused them. This defense is real. Warp time is genuinely non-linear. That's established across the setting's cosmological framework and treated as foundational metaphysics. The principle itself isn't wrong. GW just never applies it to explain why the war in heaven didn't awaken anyone. More than 60 million years ago, the most galaxy-spanning war in the setting's history was fought by multiple species, including entities specifically engineered as weapons, producing death and psychic upheaval at a scale that medieval Europe can't approach in any measurable category. The Chaos Gods didn't wake up. No explanation is offered. The time has no meaning in the warp principle, which GW invokes freely to paper over inconsistencies in the human era timeline, is never deployed to address the most obvious gap in their cosmology. The selective application is the tell. When warp time flexibility is convenient, when it explains why an event in the 31st millennium affects the 41st, or why a demon's age defies calculation, GW uses it. When it would have to explain why 60 million years of galaxy-spanning carnage produced no chaos gods at all, GW goes quiet. The defense isn't wrong in principle. It's just not doing any actual work. These deities aren't the natural endpoint of a violent universe, processing eons of war and death into divine form. They are medieval European anxiety dressed in alien skin. Khorne is warfare and bloodshed given a name and a throne of skulls, woken by the violence of Terra's European Middle Ages, confirmed as the second millennium by Wiki canon, though no specific codex year has been retrieved to pin it more precisely than that. Nurgle is the Black Death given a face, born from the same outbreak that reshaped European consciousness about mortality and divine indifference. Tzeentch is the anxious ambition of an emerging literate class, the Renaissance-adjacent fear of change and the desperate hope for it simultaneously. Slaanesh is the decadent empire at its height, which in GW's case got outsourced to an alien civilization because human Rome wasn't old enough or large enough to generate the required cosmic mass. GW built gods meant to embody universal forces, and then tethered them to a specific era on a specific planet in a universe containing millions of inhabited worlds and tens of millions of years of recorded history before humanity learned to write. Gork and Mork were born from every orc that ever lived, believed, or fought across the entire galaxy. The orc psychic gestalt, the collective weight of a species that has never stopped fighting since the Old Ones created the Krork as soldiers in the War in Heaven, sustains two gods who have existed for as long as orcs have. They didn't need a triggering event. They didn't need a specific human era. They needed orcs to be orcs, which was already true before humanity developed agriculture, before humanity developed fire, before humanity was anatomically distinguishable from its primate ancestors. By the logic GW applies to its chaos gods, Gork and Mork should be the most powerful entities in the setting. Orcs don't agonize. They don't waver between commitment and doubt. Their psychic contribution to their gods is constant, ancient, and not contingent on any particular historical moment. Khorne needed a medieval arms race on one planet. Gork needed orcs to punch something, which was already happening tens of millions of years before the first human picked up a weapon. That's the verdict on the four major gods. But GW also has a graveyard of lesser ones worth examining, because what they deleted is more revealing than what they kept. Malal, also called Malice, was a fifth chaos god whose entire concept was chaos directed inward, a self-destructive deity who existed to undermine the other four. A god of anti-chaos, paradoxically made of chaos. The community consensus holds that Malal was removed from canon due to a copyright dispute, that the rights to the character weren't cleanly held by GW, resulting in his erasure from official lore. This is community consensus, not a verified legal history. No primary source documentation has surfaced to confirm exactly who held what rights or when the dispute occurred. But Malal is gone, and the concept he represented, a god whose nature was internal contradiction, went with him. Whether the cause was legal or editorial, what GW chose to remove was the most internally coherent idea in the pantheon, a being whose existence logically destabilizes the others. That's more interesting than 3 medieval European trauma responses and a youngest god who can't hold her own against any of the siblings. Hashut, the father of darkness, originated as a chaos dwarf deity in Warhammer fantasy.
Whether he exists in 40K's cosmology at all is a question the canonical record doesn't answer. No 40K source acknowledges him in the retrieved documentation, and his home setting was discontinued, leaving him in lore limbo without resolution. GW moved on without filing the paperwork. Vashtor the Archaphane is the most recent addition to this category. He appears in the Arcs of Omen narrative and carries confirmed existence and a confirmed name. What isn't confirmed is what he actually is. Community consensus treats him as a potential new Chaos God, or a Demon Prince, or something between the two classifications. And that classification remains debated rather than settled canon. GW hasn't stated his rank clearly, which might be deliberate ambiguity, or might be another example of the setting's recurring pattern of introducing figures without fully committing to their position in the cosmological hierarchy. Both possibilities are consistent with GW's track record. What runs consistently across all three, Malal, Hashut, Vashtor, is that the gods GW abandoned, sidelined, or left deliberately undefined tend to be more conceptually interesting than the inconsistencies they chose to preserve. A self-destructive god of anti-chaos is a more coherent villain than three deities who needed a specific human era to wake up and have never explained why 60 million years of prior cosmic warfare didn't get there first. The prosecution rests. GW's own canonical timeline, as recorded in the fandom wiki and synthesized across community and codex sources, establishes that Khorne, Tzeentch, and Nurgle woke up during the European Middle Ages of Terra's second millennium. Slaanesh required the fall of the Aeldari, an early 30th millennium galactic extinction event, to be born. The War in Heaven, galaxy spanning more than 60 million years ago, involving multiple species and massive psychic upheaval, produced none of them. GW's available defense is warp time non-linearity, which is established canon but selectively deployed and never used to address the War in Heaven gap. The minor gods GW erased were more interesting than the ones they kept. The Drukhari are extortion victims, not worshippers. Tzeentch is dramatically weightless. Slaanesh costs the most and delivers the least. Nurgle employs demonic heralds whose function sits in unresolved tension with his loving father characterization and calls himself forgiving anyway. These aren't cosmic inevitabilities. They're a writing room that needed villains and reached for the history it knew. Gork would just headbutt this problem until it stopped being a problem. Mork would headbutt it when it wasn't looking. Neither of them needed a specific century. Subscribe for more.